These precious metals have been a little bit choppy, a little bit sideways with some downside, just with the desire for safe haven amid all the geopolitical unrest, and also the strengthening dollar for the same reason. So this kind of been a little bit choppy. But let's see what we've got here. Mark out some bigger zones of support. So this is a larger support zone down towards these lows. Bigger resistance somewhere through here. Obviously, it does poke through that level on this move here, but as an initial resistance, we'll look at something like this. We're trading in between this kind of support and resistance at the moment. Bit of a breakout, bit of a retest of this shorter-term counter trend line. We had a bit of a channel breakout, so maybe a projection of that channel to the downside to give us a possible target, a bit of a measured move down to here, which does line up quite nicely with the bigger support zone at the bottom. So rejection off the higher time frame resistance, in this case the 4 hour. I probably would have liked to have seen some of this move. It's probably pretty thin in terms of volume. Yeah, pretty thin day. This week is lining up to be a nice D-shaped day, so a consolidation in price. When we have these volume profiles, daily, weekly, it just shows that we've traded lots of volume, but we haven't really moved anywhere. Normally a good indication that we might have a breakout to follow. So we could take the high and the low of this previous week and say if the price breaks to the downside of this previous week, that's the indication that sellers have taken control within this consolidation. The volume traded here is being won by the sellers. See, we've got another one somewhere. So like this, for example. So a nice tight consolidation, a bit of a D shape, and then the following week we get a nice strong breakout as that volume picks up. Right, so something like that is what we'd look for. In this context, we're obviously trading to the upside and a nice strong break. Same thing down here, another D-shaped week, high of the week, low of the week, following week, a nice strong breakout to the upside. So a nice pattern that I do favor for before we have those big moves. A tight day or a tight week generally gives a nice confirmation before that breakout happens. And maybe not quite as tight as some of the others, but certainly a D shape. If we still favor that downside, could certainly be looking for a move down towards that support level below. In this case, we're using the previous week as a stop loss placement, but there is also the opportunity to say if this breaks below last week's low, that's just going to give me the bias for direction, and then I'm going to use the hourly trend to actually execute a position, say something like a fib in that move down. If we continue to hold beneath that previous week's low, that's the directional bias that we need. Maybe not this tight, but we can take something like this as a trade. Either one of those could provide a bit of opportunity for next week. We may well see a break to the upside, certainly a possibility. I would probably say if we did see the break to the upside, this area of thin volume is probably going to be the zone that would be my first point of contact that I would look for. Obviously, in a small test of that zone, if it did break up here, retest this, maybe it gives us another entry point to go short, and maybe lines up with a fib, lines up pretty nicely with a fib retracement there. So 2 or 3 possible scenarios, all of which going to the downside just on account of the current structural breaks, but that could be subject to change. Either break out through the previous week's low with a stop loss above the previous week high, trading down to the largest support within that zone. Break through the previous week's low, we start to form a shorter term downtrend, and we trade the short term downtrend with the bias of being behind the previous or below the previous week's low. Or we do break to the upside, we start to retest some resistance, we come into some thin volume, fib retracement, and we maybe look to go short off there as well. Obviously, we need some good confirmation on the breakouts. Next week we might see some developments geopolitically or whatever the case is, and we could see this start to trend higher if the dollar weakens. So we'll be a little bit fluid on potentially the direction we're trading here, but for now, as we currently stand, that's probably what I'd be focusing on at the moment. So I have another recent one. I suppose just in terms of what we were just talking about there, with if we hold beneath the previous week's low, that gives us the bias for direction. So in this case, if we're on the 4-hour time frame and we're looking at, do I want to be long or short? This day is a bit big, but this week's is a bit big. But if we're below the previous week's low, that could give us a bias for direction to be short. Now, it's not going to work every time, obviously. It needs to be in the context of what's going on. This does break the previous week's low, doesn't hold very long, and goes straight back up. But if we are holding beneath quite nicely and we start to form a lower time frame trend, possibly a hourly or possibly a 30-minute trend, then I could just simply be looking to continue this downtrend through here like this, like I normally would any trend continuation trade, but with the added confirmation of being below that previous week's low. And in this case, we get that double top. It's a bit sideways, but we get that double top breakout, and that could give us an entry then to take that trade through there. So that is probably what we could look for here next week. On a slightly short-term basis, we're retesting the bottom of that uptrend line. So whether we take a breakout just for today down towards these lows of this recent swing, also a potential. But Friday, ahead of a bank holiday,